But one of the things I found common when I interviewed shepherds and shepherdesses in the Middle East is that everyone had a great story about a lost sheep or a lost goat because it's part of their world. It's part of their world because it's part of the nature of sheep and goats to scatter. You can't have a flock go out to a field without them scattering, without them getting lost. And inevitably, at the end of the day, counting is necessary because it's not that uncommon for one to be lost. Now, usually a shepherd can retrieve them without too much trouble. Let me tell you a great story that I heard from one of the Bedouin that I interviewed, Mrs. Aref, who told me that there was a ewe that she lost track of one day. They had a hired shepherd who came back without one. And like all shepherds, she knew them all personally. She missed this one desperately because they become like family members. In the Bedouin world, this is normal. And they're so familiar with their flocks that they actually recognize missing ones, even when sometimes viewing a flock of 200 or 300. They can often say, I can see 2 or 3 that are missing because they know their habits so well and they've gotten acquainted over time. And it's really a loss that they feel not just economically but emotionally when an animal's lost. And so here's Mr. Aref telling me about this ewe, and the whole family's sitting there watching because they know how the story ends. And she said, I went on for months, and every time another shepherd came through town with some other flocks, I always asked them if they'd found a ewe and they didn't know what flock it was part of, and the answer was always no. Well, one day she came out of this little cement house where I was interviewing her. She'd grown up in tents and in caves, but now she was living in a little cement house in a very small village. And she walked out onto the street when a shepherd was going by. A huge parade of sheep that were from various flocks in the hundreds was walking through. And she called out to the shepherd who was in the front, and she said, "Have you found my lost ewe?" And at the sound of her voice, she found a surprising look. This huge mass of sheep who most of the time have their heads down and they become almost like a block of fur, all of a sudden up popped this head. And this ewe looked right at Mrs. Aref. And they basically had a reunion that you might expect between two humans. And it's precisely because all the intimacy that went into that relationship was still there. And the voice of Mrs. Aref as the shepherd was one that sheep still recognized. It had been lost, but ironically lost in another flock. It was in a crowd. It didn't look like it was lost, but in the heart of that sheep, there was something that was missing. And Mrs. Aref was that person who had invested so much. This is really what Jesus was saying in John 10. He was saying to a group of people who had been led by poor leaders who thought they were being shepherded, but they knew it wasn't the right shepherd. And Jesus said, when they hear my voice, then they come. They know me. They recognize me. And there's that reunion. And of course, in the story of the lost sheep, there's a whole party. This is exactly what happened with Mrs. Aref. She told everybody in the village, I won't bother you anymore about my lost ewe because the fact is I found her. She's home with me again.